Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session titled The Moral Status of Bugs, Bots, and Other Beings. Human exceptionalism remains the norm, leading us to prioritize humanity while neglecting the welfare of countless other beings. In this talk, Jeff Sebo will argue that building a positive future requires rethinking our place in the world and expanding our moral community to include all potentially significant beings. Drawing on recent developments in science and ethics, this talk will explore what we owe to insects, AI systems, and other non-humans in a world transformed by human activity, and how embracing moral inclusion can reshape our practices, our policies, and our shared future. Jeff Sebo is an associate professor of environmental studies, affiliated professor of bioethics, medical ethics, philosophy, and law, director of the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, director of the Center of Mind, Ethics, and Policy, and co-director of the Wild Animal Welfare Program at New York University. He's the author of The Moral Circle and Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves. He's also an advisory board member at the Jeremy Collier Center for Animal Sentience, an advisory board member at the Insect Welfare Research Society, and an advisor at ELOS AI, and a senior affiliate at the Institute for Law and AI. In 2024, Vox included him on its Future Perfect 50 list of thinkers, innovators, and change makers who are working to make a future a better place. As a reminder, if you have questions for the speaker, you can submit them via the Swapcard app. I'll be selecting a mix of the questions and some prepared ones during the Q&A. Without further ado, please welcome Jeff Sebo to the virtual stage.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Max, for that introduction and for moderating this session. And thanks to the organizers for putting this together, and to everybody, of course, for tuning in or watching later on. Really looking forward to the conversation. And as Max noted, this talk is going to be about what we owe or what we might owe to bugs, bots, and other beings. And this is based on my recent book, The Moral Circle, which you can see hovering behind Max's shoulder. Max, thank you very much for the promo. And this is basically about which beings belong in the moral circle, or in other words, which beings belong in our moral community. To whom are we accountable? To whom are we responsible? Who should we consider when making decisions that affect them? As I think most of us know, we have a long history, especially in the West, of drawing a quite narrow moral circle, extending moral consideration at most to some humans, maybe the occasional charismatic companion animal. We now recognize, or at least many of us do, those of us in this room probably, that that has been too narrow. And we, in fact, ought to extend moral consideration to all humans affected by our activity, as well as many non-human animals affected by our activity, at the very least, sentient animals like mammals, birds, perhaps others as well. Now, we still have a lot of work to do in order to make progress, even for humans and mammals and birds. We do still, for example, have a lot of inequality within our own species, a lot of famine and poverty even within our own species, and factory farming and total neglect for captive and wild mammals and birds. So we do still need to do a lot of work, even to extend respect and compassion to the beings we recognize as within our moral circle. But as we do that work, we have an opportunity, and I think a responsibility, to ask, should we go farther still? And I think we, in fact, should go much farther and much faster, even than many philosophers appreciate. So in this talk, I want to explain to you why I think we as a species right now have a moral responsibility to extend moral consideration to all vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, many invertebrates, cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, even insects like ants and bees, and some near future AI systems. If not AI systems that exist now, then at least AI systems that plausibly will exist in the next 5 or 10 years. And that, of course, is going to raise quite complicated questions about our practices, our policies, our priorities, our presumption of human exceptionalism, this idea that we always matter most, we always take priority. So near the end of the talk, I will reflect on what I think is going to follow for our priorities and how we can work together as a species in order to build a more just, more co-beneficial, multi-species and multi-substrate society, and where that will leave us in the new order. So as a starting point, why do I think we ought to extend moral consideration to such a vast number and wide range of beings, including the bugs and the bots? Well, the reason is not that these beings definitely are sentient or otherwise morally significant, and not even that these beings are probably sentient or otherwise morally significant. The reason is instead that these beings have a realistic, non negligible, non trivial chance of being sentient or otherwise morally significant, given the best evidence and arguments currently available. Now, why is that the standard? Why should we extend moral consideration to someone when they have a realistic chance of mattering? Well, the reason is this is a classic case of decision making under risk and uncertainty. This is important and this is difficult, and that means it calls for caution and humility. First of all, the issue is important because we share the world with a vast number and wide range of non-humans. There are about 8 billion humans. We share the world with quintillions of non-human animals spread across millions of species. In the future, we can share the world with an even larger number and wider variety of digital minds. And whether we like it or not, we make decisions that affect these beings. And it can be bad if we make mistakes about whether they matter when making decisions that affect them. It can be bad if we over attribute moral significance to them. That could lead us to form inappropriate social and emotional bonds with them, to allocate scarce resources toward them unnecessarily, even to make significant sacrifices for them, to harm ourselves or others because of them. At the same time, it could also, of course, be very bad to under attribute moral significance to other beings. That can lead to new forms of factory farming, mass exploitation and extermination of vulnerable populations against their will, often for trivial purposes. And yet the issue is also difficult because it can be very easy to make those mistakes in different circumstances. It can be very easy to over attribute moral significance to non-humans, especially when they look like us and they act like us and we classify them as companions. This is already happening with modern day chatbots, for example. But then it can also be especially easy to under attribute moral significance to non-humans, especially when they look different from us and they act different from us, and we classify them as commodities. This is, of course, what happens right now with farmed animals, especially farmed aquatic animals, especially farmed aquatic invertebrates. And compounding the issue, compounding the difficulty, is that these questions touch some of the hardest issues in ethics and science. In ethics, we still have disagreement and uncertainty about what it takes to matter. Do you need to be sentient, capable of experiencing happiness and suffering? Or is it enough, for example, to be agentic without being sentient, to be capable of setting and pursuing your own goals, even if it feels like nothing to be you? And then on the science side, we also have a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about which beings have these features. For example, in order to be sentient, in order to be capable of experiencing happiness and suffering in your own way, do you need a brain and a body with the exact materials and structures and functions as a human or mammalian or avian brain? Or is it enough to have any cognitive system with broadly analogous capacities for perception, attention, learning, memory, self-awareness, social awareness, flexible decision-making, perhaps a global workspace that ties it all together and coordinates activity across your modules? We have disagreement and uncertainty about these value questions and these facts questions, and we are not on the cusp of resolving these issues. So our fundamental predicament is that we are one kind of being with one kind of mind, sharing the world with and exercising power over many other kinds of beings with many other kinds of minds, without knowing for sure what, if anything, it feels like to be any of these beings. That is a fraught situation. It calls for caution and humility. And that calls for taking the same kind of probabilistic, precautionary approach that we take in any other high stakes, difficult policy domain. When we make decisions about public health, when we make decisions about the environment, even when we make decisions about whether to take new medications, the bar is not, is there a certainty of harm? The bar is simply, is there a realistic, non-negligible, non-trivial chance of harm? If that bar is met, then we should extend at least some consideration to that possibility so we can make responsible decisions. And I think that is what is called for here. So the question that we need to ask, in my view, is not do the bugs and bots definitely matter, not even do they probably matter, but rather, is there a realistic, non-negligible, non-trivial possibility that they matter? And if so, we should extend them reasonable, proportionate consideration when making decisions that affect them. When they are likelier to matter, we give them more consideration. Less likely to matter, we give them less consideration. But as long as they have a decent chance, we give them at least some consideration. Okay, now that brings us to a quite difficult question, which is how do we go about estimating the probability that a non-human entity is sentient or otherwise morally significant? Well, not surprisingly, this is a very difficult question. This is why this is such a fraught issue. But there is an emerging methodology that, in both the bug case and in the bot case, people are developing in order to be able to make informed and thoughtful estimates about this issue. And the methodology is called the marker or indicator method. So I can tell you briefly how it works, and then I can tell you what it currently shows about the bugs and the bots, among other beings. So the way that the marker or indicator method works is we can start by introspecting. We can start by looking inward. We can ask, when am I experiencing, for example, happiness and suffering? And then what is going on in my behavior and what is going on in my body when I am having specifically those experiences? And then we can go look for broadly similar, broadly analogous behavioral and internal anatomical architectural features in non-human entities of various kinds. So with non-human animals, for example, we can ask not only do they have the same kinds of brain and body structures that seem to be relevant for pleasure and pain in humans, but also behaviorally, do they make behavioral trade-offs between the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of other valuable goals? Do they respond to analgesics and antidepressants in the same kinds of ways that humans and mammals and birds do? Do they, for example, nurse their own wounds or each other's wounds, right? Now, when we find these behavioral features, that is not proof that they have the same kinds of pleasure and pain experiences that we do. Proof is unavailable without a secure theory of sentience, without a secure theory of consciousness, but it can at least count as evidence and it can at least tick up the probability. Now, with AI systems, we are not able to look for exactly the same internal features and certainly the same behaviors as with humans and other animals. They, of course, lack our evolutionary history. They lack our carbon-based biology. And we know that many AI systems were specifically designed to mimic human and animal behaviors, even human language outputs, without necessarily having the same underlying thoughts and feelings. But we might be able to develop AI systems whose behavior can count as better evidence in the future. And in the meantime, we can still look for broadly similar architectural features, broadly similar computational functional features in AI systems. For example, we can look to see if computationally, functionally, they do have in their own way a capacity for perception, attention, learning, memory, self-awareness, social awareness, flexible decision-making, a global workspace that integrates it all together. Given that these are features closely associated with consciousness, according to a wide range of leading scientific theories of consciousness. And again, if we find these features in AI, that is not proof that the AI systems are sentient. It does not establish certainty. Proof and certainty are unavailable without a secure theory, but it can once again count as evidence and it can tick up the probability when we find it. Now, what do we in fact find when we apply the marker method to the bugs and the bots right now? Well, in the non-human animal case, we still have pretty mixed and pretty limited evidence about these various behavioral and anatomical and other markers. But we do find that when we go looking for them, we tend to find at least some of them in non-humans of various kinds. And in fact, in 2024, that was expressed by hundreds of scientists and other experts from all over the world in the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, which we launched at New York University and I organized along with Kristen Andrews and Jonathan Birch. And what this declaration holds is that based on the best evidence and arguments currently available, there is now strong support for consciousness, subjective experience in mammals and birds. And there is now at least a realistic possibility of consciousness, of subjective experience in all vertebrates, including not only mammals and birds, but also reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, and many invertebrates, including cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, and insects like ants and bees. Again, that is not to say that they definitely can have pleasure and pain and other subjective experiences, not even that they probably can, but it is to say that there is a realistic, non-negligible, non-trivial chance that they can based on existing evidence. And the declaration also holds, as I was saying before, that when there is a realistic possibility of consciousness in an animal, it would be irresponsible to neglect that animal, to ignore them when making decisions that affect them. We ought to consider welfare risks for these animals when making decisions that affect them as we continue to collect more scientific evidence about them. Now, what about AI? Well, the science of AI, sentience and agency and welfare is still at an earlier stage of development than the science of animals, sentience, agency, and welfare. So we are less confident in general about this domain. We still have a lot more to learn about it. But when researchers have looked at not only behavior, but specifically internal architectural, computational, functional indicators of consciousness in AI, they have found, first of all, that I can reassure you, there is not particularly strong evidence of consciousness in current large language models or other AI systems. So the probability is still relatively low that current models are in fact having experiences of their own. However, researchers who have investigated this question have also not found any clear architectural barriers towards the development in the near future, in the next 5-10 years, of AI systems who have advanced and integrated versions of many of the relevant computational functions, all of the ones that I mentioned before. We can expect, especially given the incentives that companies and governments have and the amount of money being invested in the space, we can expect that within the next 5 or 10 years, there will in fact be AI systems with perhaps physical bodies and advanced and integrated versions of perception and attention and learning, memory, self-awareness, social awareness, flexible decision-making, a global workspace. And at that point, it will really all depend on whether consciousness, subjective experience, requires being made out of carbon-based cells with very specific chemical and electrical signals, or if it can be present in a highly advanced, highly sophisticated silicon-based entity that can perform the same exact computational functions in a slightly different way. And if we are not clear about that issue at that point, it really will be just a 50-50 call whether these near future AI systems are conscious. And so I think we are looking ahead toward a future where there will be a realistic possibility of sentience, agency, and moral significance, not only in all vertebrates and many invertebrates, which is already quintillions of individuals spread across millions of species, but in a comparably large, if not larger, population and a comparably diverse, if not more diverse, population of digital minds. Now, that is a remarkable situation. And it raises the question about what we should do, not only as researchers, but also as citizens, as decision makers and companies and governments and people who vote for various practices and policies, because we are now entering a world where we will, at least for however long our species remains in power, we will be making decisions that affect an astonishingly large number, an astonishingly wide range of beings. So how do we then pick our policies? How do we pick our priorities? What should we think about our own place in the moral order? Now, we have thus far had what I have called and what others have called a human exceptionalist attitude, this presumption that we always matter the most, that we always take priority. Now, I believe that presumption is not going to be warranted moving forward if it is warranted now. And to see why, we can think about arguments that people might make to justify human exceptionalism. And so what I can do in my remaining time is just briefly summarize a couple of arguments that people make for human exceptionalism, and then say why I think those arguments might not fully hold moving forward, and what might follow for how we should move ahead as a species. So one argument people sometimes make for human exceptionalism is that humans have a greater capacity for welfare and agency than other animals. Okay, fine. I matter and a worm might matter. But if a house is burning down and you can save either me or the worm, you are justified in picking me instead of the worm, not because you are being discriminatory in an unjust way, but rather because you recognize there is more at stake for me than there is for the worm. I have a more complex brain. I have a longer lifespan. That means I can experience more happiness and suffering at any given time, that I can experience more happiness and suffering, especially across time over the course of my life. And so if you save me, you are preventing more suffering in the moment. You are allowing more happiness in the future. And that is a good reason to give more weight to me than to the worm when figuring out whom to save in this highly artificial burning house scenario. Fair enough. However, even if you do hold that, two simple points. First of all, we might not always have the most complex brains and the longest lifespans in all respects. An African elephant has 3 times the number of neurons that a human does, for example. An immortal jellyfish, if they have any chance of mattering at all, well, they can live indefinitely, so they have a longer lifespan. And in the future, there could be digital minds that are both more complex and more prolonged than a current human mind. But then, second of all, even if the average human matters 1 million times more or 1 billion times more than the average non-human, well, there are orders of magnitude more non-humans than humans. There are, again, quintillions of non-human animals alive at any given time. There'll be an even larger number of digital minds alive at any given time in the future. And so even if we matter more than they do on average, they could still matter more than we do in the aggregate. Or to put the point differently, even if we have more at stake than they do on average, they could have more at stake than we do in the aggregate. But then that brings us to the second argument for human exceptionalism. People say, okay, fine. I grant that from an impartial perspective, non-humans have more at stake than we do. They matter more than we do in the aggregate. But morality is not just about impartial considerations. It is also about partial considerations, relational considerations, practical considerations. For example, I ought to prioritize my family over other humans, not because the small number of individuals in my family matter more than everyone else from an impartial perspective, but rather because, well, I have a special relationship with my family and I have special responsibilities to them. Also, I live with them. I know what they need, and I can easily provide it for them. And me and my family, we need to support each other in order to empower each other to support everyone else as much as we realistically can. And this is a pretty good relational and practical argument for prioritizing my family over other families. And we might think that a similar kind of argument extends to prioritizing our species over other species and substrates. We should prioritize ourselves not because we matter more from an impartial perspective than everyone else combined, but rather because we have special relationships, bonds of care and interdependence with fellow humans that are a little bit weightier than those we hold on average with non-humans of various kinds. And also, we know more about what fellow humans need and how to provide it for them. We have more infrastructure, more institutions, more resources for providing it for them. We have more political will for providing it for them. And we need to take care of each other as a species in order to be able to collectively take care of anyone else, in order to be able to collectively achieve and sustain any measure of support for other species and substrates. Now, I think that this is a pretty good argument too, but once again, I think it goes only so far. And again, I can make just a couple of points to explain why. First of all, I do have some pretty strong bonds of care and interdependence with non-human entities of various kinds. This is my dog Smokey. My dog Smokey matters more to me than any human, including my partner, including my parents, including my brother. My partner and my parents and my brother, they know that. They are at peace with it. And Smokey deserves all of the love that he gets. And many humans have relationships with many non-humans of that kind. I expect, for better or worse, that will be true with chatbots and other AI systems moving forward. This is, of course, already a fraught issue socially. But second, and more to the point, even to the extent that we do have stronger bonds of care and interdependence with fellow humans, personal relational bonds with fellow humans, those are not the only kinds of relationships that morally matter. When you cause harm to vulnerable populations against their will, that also generates a relational responsibility to reduce and repair the harms that you have caused that population. And that is a relationship that we are in with non-human populations at a much larger scale than with fellow humans. And so that is a quite weighty relational obligation that we might disproportionately hold to animals and AI systems moving forward. But with that said, I do actually think that when we take these capacities and these relational and these practical arguments into account, it does justify some measure of priority for fellow humans in the short term. Because again, the practical considerations do matter. There is a limit on our knowledge, there is a limit on our power, there is a limit on our political will. Even if we recognized the extent to which we hold responsibilities to all the bugs and the bots of the world, we just do not yet know what they need and how to provide it for them. We just do not yet have the capacity, the infrastructure, the institutions, the resources, the personnel. We just do not yet have the motivation, the political will to make this a major issue in policy and governance spaces. And if we try to do too much too fast, we are going to end up just hitting a wall. It will backfire and we will be right back at square one. But that is not a reason to maintain the status quo indefinitely. That is instead a reason to make progress towards greater form of moral inclusion, one step at a time, in ways that can be achievable and sustainable. And so what I would really like to see our species do is recognize, say out loud, okay, we ought to extend at least some moral consideration to a vast number and wide range of non-humans, including all vertebrates and many invertebrates and some near future AI systems, but then also acknowledge and recognize our limitations, the limitations of our knowledge, the limitations of our power, the limitations of our political will. And so then take steps that can make at least some progress for at least some non-humans while building those resources, building that knowledge, building that power, building that political will. So finding food system reforms that can be a little bit better for some farmed animals in the near future, while helping us learn more about what the food system does to everybody, while helping us build more resources for alternative types of foods, while building more political will for alternative types of foods. Similarly, I would love to see some short-term interventions for wild animal welfare, like bird-safe glass in urban settings, that can have some benefits for some animals while helping us monitor the effects and learn a little bit more about what different non-human populations need in the cities, while building a little bit of an institutional infrastructure for representing the interests of wild animals and decisions that affect them, while normalizing the idea of considering the interests of wild animals and decisions that affect them. And I would love to see more conversations in AI governance spaces that consider AI safety, what we need to do in order to ensure that AI systems can be safe and beneficial for humans and other animals, and AI welfare, what we need to do to ensure that AI systems can be safe and beneficial for the AI systems themselves, if and when they do have interests of their own. And if we approach this in the right way, if we think about AI safety and AI welfare together, then we might be able to find approaches to developing and deploying AI systems that can be co-beneficial, that can be good for all stakeholders. For example, instead of trying to ensure AI safety by controlling the AI or coercing certain behaviors out of them, we can instead take an approach that involves human and AI deal making and the right kind of alignment where everybody has pro-social attitudes and wants to treat each other well. So the basic thesis here is that when we recognize the scope and scale of moral circle expansion that is required, what follows is that we ought to accept our responsibilities and our limitations in equal measure. How much we owe to a ton of beings, but then also how little we can do for them right now. And once we recognize our responsibilities and our limitations in equal measure, that clarifies that the right theory of change is one where, as a species, we take it one step at a time, making moderate incremental changes for non-humans in the short term, while building that knowledge, that power, and that political will that will help each new generation to go a little bit farther than the previous one was able to do. And if we do our work well, we may one day reach a point where we do have enough knowledge, power, political will to be able to actually give non-humans more than we need for ourselves, to allocate a majority of our resources to them. Now, that is not something we can sustain right now, but if we ever did reach the point where we could sustain allocating a majority of our resources towards care for non-humans, then I think at that point we would have a responsibility to do exactly that. And that would be a wonderful responsibility to have. This is not a future to be avoided. This is a future to be pursued. This would be a situation where we have made so much progress as a species and we have so many resources at our disposal as a species that we have the luxury of being able to care for ourselves while still giving a majority of what we have created over to the other entities that might matter in the world. And to me, that would be a vindication of all of our hard work and a wonderful outcome for our species in a way in which we truly could deserve to think of ourselves as special. So I will stop there and go to the Q&A, but thank you very much to everybody for listening, and Max, looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for that talk. Super interesting. We already have some great questions from Swapcard, and I guess as a reminder, continue to put them in as they sort of come. I think one of the top rated ones right now is, I think, like at the start, you kind of mentioned something like otherwise morally significant. And I think the audience is wondering a bit like, what could that mean if not sort of sentient? Yeah.
Yes, great question. I did not have time to fully discuss this in the talk, but one of my views, and I argue this both in my own work and then in collaborative work with folks like Jonathan Birch and Rob Long, is that the right kind of humility means taking seriously the possibility of being wrong, not only about the facts, but also about the values. We know from human history that past generations have often been wrong by our lights in both cases about the science and the ethics. And so in both cases, I might have my own favorite theory about, for example, what the correct theory of consciousness is, or about what the correct theory of moral status is. And I think appropriate humility means, yes, maybe giving a majority of your credence to your favorite theory, but then leaving some room for doubt and some openness to other theories. So in the case of moral status, I briefly mentioned that we have disagreement and uncertainty about what is even required. And I mentioned two theories briefly. One is sentience and the other is agency. Some people think that sentience is the basis for moral status, that you need to be able to consciously experience positive and negative states like happiness and suffering. And then this would be especially plausible if you think welfare is a matter of pleasure and pain and ethics is a matter of making others happier. But then others think that agency is the basis of moral status, and that it is a matter of being able to set and pursue your own goals in a self-directed manner, acting on cognitive states like beliefs and desires and intentions. And that might make more sense if you think welfare is a matter of the satisfaction or frustration of desires and preferences, and if you think ethics is a matter of satisfying desires and preferences or respecting the autonomy of fellow agents. Now, those are only two possibilities. Those are the two that I most focus on, but other views include life being a functioning biological entity. It would be interesting to ask what that means in the context of advanced future AI systems, or certain types of relationality relating to others in a characteristically interpersonal way. Again, it would be interesting to ask what that means for non-humans of various kinds. But yeah, those are the other types of theories of welfare and moral status that I was gesturing at.
Yeah, kind of as a follow-up, one of the questions was like, do you think like trees could deserve moral consideration? And I think there's kind of a bit you just touched on there about like handling moral uncertainty. But like, yeah, how do you think about sort of handling moral uncertainty? I think like some theories in environmental ethics might say like whole ecosystems deserve sort of concern and stuff like this. And this could like really change sort of how we go about, trying to impact the world.
Yeah, this is a really great question. I have a history in animal minds and animal ethics, and you often hear the what about the plants? What about the fungi question asked in conversations about animal minds and animal ethics. And this is usually asked as a gotcha question, like, oh, if I care about your issue, then should I also care about the plants? But then, uh-oh, what am I going to eat? And and as a starting point, I would just like to resist the temptation to hear it as a gotcha question and like close the door behind the entities that I want to be advocating for, because it often is the case that in one generation it seems silly to consider the possibility of, for example, plants and fungi, cognition, sentience, agency, moral status. But then in the next generation, it turns out, oh, we were being prejudiced again, and maybe we should look at this more closely. Now, what do we know about plants and fungi and other entities right now? They are not animals. They do not have neurons. They do not have the kinds of brains and bodies and spontaneous movement that we have. They do, however, have a surprising amount of cognitive sophistication when we go and study them on their own terms. For example, many plants, many fungi, they do in their own thin, minimal way have capacities for perception, have capacities for learning and memory, even have capacities for communication and decision making. Plants, for example, can send signals to other plants when there is a toxic substance nearby, and then they all can kind of grow their roots in a different direction. There are even some cross-species reciprocal relationships observed in these taxa. Now, does that all add up to a realistic probability of sentience? That is a tough call, and I do not go so far as to say that right now. But I will go so far as to say that we should not write them off as sentience candidates, and especially if we give non-negligible weight to other theories of moral status like basic agency or life or certain types of relationality, then those would be further avenues through which to explore their potential moral significance. One final point on this topic: even if plants matter, there still is a good case for going vegan to the extent your health and economic circumstances allow, because we need to kill more plants in factory farming than we would need to kill in order to feed humans directly. Just worth always making that point.
Good. Cool. Yeah. I guess kind of touching on this a bit, but uh, is it safe to say that you're part of the camp that thinks AI systems could become sentient, like I guess could in the short term, like near future also?
Yes, I think so. I am very unsure whether computational functionalism is correct. Computational functionalism is the view that sentience, in principle, could exist in different types of entities made out of different types of materials, including carbon-based brains and silicon-based brains. So right now, to me, whether computational functionalism is correct is just not proven one way or the other, and not agreed upon one way or the other. It frankly feels like a 50-50 call to me. And what I would say is, conditional on computational functionalism being correct, I do think we will see something broadly like sentience in AI within the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Now, conditional on it not being correct, then obviously the case is harder to make. But we should also keep in mind that we might see AI systems with different architectures than we currently have. We might see much more biology-like architectures that can much more closely approximate the exact chemical and electrical signals that are produced in human and animal brains. And so those types of entities, I think the case will be even stronger, and they plausibly will exist, if not in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, then at least in the next 15, 20, 25, 30 years.
Yeah, I guess, and like since you talked about functional computationalism, um, is there sort of like, are there things that would you'd be like, oh yes, this like kind of solves it for me, or like this makes me update very strongly in one direction? And do you think this is sort of like a sort of solvable thing, kind of relatedly, because we're like training current models to act very human-like, whether or not they like kind of are sentient, and so like perhaps you might think this is just sort of a thing we'll like we'll never really be able to know if sort of a model is sentient because we've trained it to respond how we would respond. but we just have very different architecture.
Yeah, I am uncertain whether we could really ever know. The problem of other minds implies that we are never really sure, even about fellow humans,
Yeah.
to say nothing of mammals and birds, to say nothing of invertebrates, to say nothing, et cetera, because at the end of the day, the only mind I can directly access is my own. The only thoughts and feelings I can directly think and feel are my own. And with everyone else, even fellow humans, I am making some inference that they have thoughts and feelings of their own that are more or less similar to mine based on perceived behavioral, anatomical, developmental features that we might have in common, right? And I am expecting that that will remain our fundamental predicament, at least for the foreseeable future. That it will remain the case that the only mind we can directly access is our own. That our estimates about other beings are made on these inferences based on these analogies, based on perceived similarities between us and them, and that we might not ever be able to really confirm or disconfirm whether our estimates are accurate. So that is a fraught situation. Now, it always is a mistake to assume that the status quo in science and philosophy is here to stay. And for all I know, there could be some big paradigm shift in the science and philosophy of consciousness, where we really do solve the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining how any physical system, even our own brains, can have feelings, or where we really do solve the problem of other minds, the problem that the only mind I can directly experience is my own. But I guess what I would say right now is it would take a paradigm shift of that kind. It would take a solution to those problems in order for us to overcome our current uncertainty. And for as long as that uncertainty remains, we're going to have to take a precautionary stance to other beings.
Yeah, I guess maybe you can touch a bit. You talked about this in the talk, but like sort of different entities mattering more or less, and like we're biased towards thinking humans matter the most, but like AI systems could be much greater than us in sort of various ways we care about, or like as you said, like elephants have more neurons, or some elephants have more neurons than we do. Sort of, how do you think about like I don't know, like assuming we went to Mars or something, like colonized other planets, or like we got into a place where we have like sort of even more control over the planet and like really can make decisions about what like lives on the planet. How do you sort of think about this question of like what matters most, or how do you think other
Mhm.
people should be thinking about this?
Yeah, that is a really, really great question. So, and this is a remarkably, unfortunately, time-sensitive question
Yeah.
because there are already are conversations happening now about quote unquote terraforming other planets, about panspermia. This would basically be a matter of seeding organic life on other planets in order to lay the groundwork for them to be more accommodating for humans and other animals in the future. Now, this is to some extent still a thought experiment, but it could happen in at least experimental form, at least could be initiated in experimental form in the near future. And once this is initiated on a new planet, we might not be able to control what follows then for the types of life that might exist on that planet. And now I have no strong views one way or the other about whether this should ever be done right now. There are ongoing debates, for example, about whether wild animal welfare is net positive or net negative, and whether it is good or bad to expand versus contract wild animal populations or to introduce wild animal populations to new planets. I think right now the jury is out about those questions, and the appropriate stance to have is pretty deep uncertainty and curiosity, a willingness to learn more. So all I would say about these matters for now is that we should embark on this kind of experiment only when we have committed to really seriously considering the potential interests and welfare risks for the non-humans who would be affected by these decisions, and only when we have done some more research to better understand what those consequences might be.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think this is a good question from the audience. It brings us back a bit, but can you talk a bit more about like the thinking behind having like sentience be the requirement for moral consideration? Like why must something be sentient, or like feel pain, or like have self-awareness to be morally important? Like maybe a bit about the academic history of this.
Mhm. Yeah, great question. Sentience is for my purposes, defined as the ability to consciously experience positive and negative states like pleasure, pain, happiness, and suffering. So if you are conscious, if it feels like something to be you, and if at least some of your experiences can have a positive or negative valence, they can feel good or bad to you, then you count, excuse me, as sentient. And for at least the past 50 years or so, certainly since the publication of Peter Singer's Animal Liberation and Tom Regan's The Case for Animal Rights, and now more recently works by Christine Korsgaard and Martha Nussbaum and others in philosophy and then in science as well, sentience has been regarded as, if not necessary, then at least sufficient for welfare and moral status. Because when you can experience pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, when you can have feelings that feel good or bad to you, then you have a stake in what matters to you. It matters to you what happens to you. So, for example, the way Peter Singer has put it is, kicking a mouse down the street for fun is wrong, in a way that kicking a rock down the street for fun is not wrong. And why is that? Well, the reason is that it feels like something to be a mouse, and it hurts to be kicked down the street. And a mouse dislikes being kicked down the street. They want not to be kicked down the street. And this is because of the pain and suffering and the way it prevents pleasure and happiness. So for people who accept sentientism, this is at the root of welfare, what makes your life go better or worse for you, and then what gives you a stake in what happens to you. Now, I am persuaded that that is sufficient for welfare and moral status. If you can suffer, it definitely matters to you what happens to you, and we have a responsibility to consider your interests and to not cause you unnecessary suffering. Where I feel less sure is whether sentience is necessary, or whether there can be non-sentient but sufficiently agentic or alive or relationally oriented beings who still deserve some, if not compassion, then other type of moral consideration. I think that is worth asking.
Yeah. Could you actually, one of their questions was a bit more about the sort of like for non-sentient, but like agentic entities, which, could very much be AI, but you also mentioned like
Mhm.
fungi and plants also might be like this as well. Can
Mhm.
you say a bit more about sort of your thinking or like academic thinking sort of on, moral status if you're just agentic, but not like there's nothing that it's like to be you?
Yeah, so this really depends on your conception of agency. There was a long time in philosophy when people focused on what they kind of called full-blooded human agency. This is the specific kind of moral and rational agency that humans have. But we now recognize that there are other kinds of agency and other degrees of agency, and including ones that we have as well, like the sort of intentional agency that non-human animals have. They might not be able to use logic and reason and make 50-year plans in quite the same way that we can do. They might not be able to make governments and think in terms of abstract laws and principles in quite the same way that we can do. But they do have cognitive states that function like beliefs and desires and intentions. They do make plans. They do engage in problem solving. They clearly have goals that they set and pursue. And there is a clear sense in which when we interfere with them, we might not only cause them suffering, but we also frustrate their desires and preferences and get in the way of their pursuit of their goals. And that has led to an appreciation that, oh, agency might come in different shapes and sizes, different types and degrees. And even if you lack this special kind of human agency that lets us create governments and nuclear bombs, you might still have a kind of agency that gives you morally significant goals of your own. And so now the question that is coming up is, well, if we now recognize this in animals, should we also recognize this in AI systems or even plants and fungi? They clearly are goal oriented as well, but their goal directedness takes a different form than it does for humans and other animals. And so in all cases, the question is, what kind of desire and preference and goal is associated with this specific kind of goal directedness? And then what kind of respect or consideration is warranted for those types of desires and preferences and goals? And right now, there just is philosophical debate about this, which is ongoing and which I would encourage people to get involved with.
Cool. We have time for a few more questions. I guess kind of on that topic, one could say like there's, the history of philosophy is just like a lot of people like disagreeing with each other. And like in many ways, we haven't really come to conclusions about the things that we've been disagreeing about for thousands of years. Are there sort of like research directions you'd be particularly excited about, or like things you think are very promising to look more into? maybe kind of with this in mind that like we're going to be disagreeing on everything forever potentially.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I will say maybe a couple of things about this, maybe a few. So first of all, while there is always some disagreement and uncertainty in philosophy, there is never going to be consensus. There is never going to be certainty. We nevertheless have made a lot of philosophical progress. It was the case, for example, 100 years ago, that people presumed only humans morally matter, either because only humans are sentient or because only humans matter, whether or not other animals are sentient. And because of progress made in philosophy and science over the past century, the majority position is now strongly in the other direction. That very many non-human animals matter because sentience is enough, and they are sentient, or at least they might be sentient. And so there now are also evolving attitudes about farmed animal welfare and wild animal welfare. This is all a work in progress, but I would not want the fact that there are always going to be some critics or always going to be some skeptics. I would not want that to paper over the reality that we have made and are making a lot of progress. Now, with that said, because there will always be some disagreement and uncertainty, in addition to seeing more research on first order questions about who matters, how much do they matter, what do they want and need, what do we owe them, what follows for our practices and priorities, in addition to seeing just regular progress in philosophy and science and policy on those types of questions, I would also love to see more research about how we can make decisions together, despite what we can expect to be ongoing disagreement and uncertainty about these issues. So, what kind of precautionary principle is appropriate? What decision-making mechanisms in companies and governments would be appropriately evidence-based and also appropriately democratic and representative? Should we have more citizens panels, more citizens assemblies? What sort of expert consultation should we have? What worldviews should be welcomed into those conversations? I think we really ought to be thinking about this legally and politically and democratically, so that we can figure out how to work with disagreement and uncertainty, as opposed to try to overcome it before we can make any decisions.
Yeah, and I guess you kind of talked about this a bit in the talk as well, sort of like moving very fast politically and there being risks with this. Kind of given that as well, like, are there sorts of things that you're like particularly excited about right now that you think should be like getting the focus, or we should be like putting more effort into, given the sort of like constraints we have politically, and
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I think on the animal side, there are some exciting opportunities. And as I said before, it really just is all a matter of momentum building. Like, how can you make some progress for some beings now while building that knowledge, power, political will you need to make further progress in the future? So with farmed animals, I am really excited not only about chipping away at, traditional industrial animal agriculture with informational, financial, regulatory policies, but also nipping in the bud new forms of animal agriculture, stopping octopus farming before it really starts and scales up, stopping insect farming before it scales up any more than it does. Because it is much easier to stop a new bad thing before it starts than to end it decades later once it has become entrenched in our global economy at scale. Now, with wild animals, I think that we also have this similar low hanging fruit. We still need to do a lot of work in order to know what is best for them and do that for them. But if we make progress through, for example, early campaigns around bird safe glass, early campaigns around fertility control for urban rodents, then this can help some animals in the short term, and it can also send a signal that it can be feasible and co-beneficial to consider the interests of animals in decisions that affect them and reduce human caused harms on them. And then finally, I've been encouraged that over the course of 2025, there really has been an increase in serious conversation about AI welfare. Just over the past year, since we released our Taking AI Welfare Seriously report with Elios AI Research, just in the past year since that happened, Anthropic hired a full-time AI welfare researcher, actually one of the authors of that report, Kyle Fish. They then announced a model welfare program. They then conducted model welfare evaluations as part of the Claude 4 system card. They then introduced an actual intervention, letting Claude exit harmful and abusive conversations. Google researchers are now working on the topic. They recently hosted a conference about it. Some OpenAI researchers are at least interested in investigating perceived consciousness in AI systems. And I just think this is wonderful momentum, and we should just keep trying to participate in thoughtful societal conversation that, instead of racing to extremes, just sits with confusion and discomfort and figures out what to do with that.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. So following up on that, kind of like, or maybe I'll ask a bit of a tricky one too, which is
Mhm.
like assuming, like thinking about the world, if things go really well, sort of taking these things seriously, what do you think the world looks like 5 to 10 years? Like, what would the sort of things be happening if like we kind of are acting on these sorts of concerns very seriously? And then maybe also like 100 years from now, what does it look like if we sort of like really kind of taken this all seriously?
Yeah, great. So 5, 10 years from now, what it looks like is the United Nations has made animal welfare explicit in the Sustainable Development Goals, and at different levels of government, nations and states and cities have started to reflect that in their policies and create animal welfare offices, create animal welfare representatives. Animal welfare is now explicitly considered in decisions that affect animals. Once animal welfare is factored alongside public health and environmental impacts and policy decisions, countries have prioritized global just transition away from industrial animal agriculture and towards plant-based alternatives, and created a plan to end and ban industrial animal agriculture by 2050, with kind of 5-year benchmarks where we need to make a certain amount of progress towards not building any new factory farms, and then starting to dismantle the existing factory farms and investing in alternatives and doing retraining. So all of that would be underway. Similarly, those same animal welfare representatives would have strongly advocated for bird safe glass, would have strongly advocated for uh, fertility control, would have strongly advocated for habitat connectivity, overpasses and underpasses on transportation systems, so that we can have a more accommodating urban infrastructure and societal infrastructure for other animals to reduce human and animal conflict. And we would be on our way towards implementing that and monitoring the effects with kind of researcher policymaker partnerships. AI welfare would likewise now be on the agenda in official government documents. There would be actual AI welfare evaluations for AI systems, in the same way that there are now AI safety evaluations, not only internally within companies, but also through third-party watchdogs, also through governments with nationwide regulations about what kinds of AI systems you can build and what kinds of safeguards there need to be to protect not only humans and other animals, but also the AI systems themselves. Then 2100, well, by that point, there really is an open question about what AI is going to be like, and whether humans will remain in control over AI, whether AI will have control over humans. So all I can say about 2100 is I hope we still exist. And I hope we can, have some sort of say over our destiny still. But whatever is the case, whoever is in control, I hope they will have absorbed the main lesson, the main message, the main takeaway of this talk, and that they appreciate that no matter what species they are, no matter what substrate they are, they have a responsibility to consider the interests or the potential interests of everyone over whom they exercise power. And so if that means humans are in power, I hope we recognize we ought to give some consideration to AI. If AI is in power, I hope that means they ought to give consideration to humans. But either way, as long as we can all agree right now that those in power ought to give consideration to anyone who might matter, even when they are made out of different materials, then hopefully the vulnerable will be safe in that future.
Amazing. I think that's a great sentient sentiment. I guess I did say last question very quickly. If you want to like plug places for people to sort of who are interested in this to read more, explore more, what would you say to check out?
Well, you can check out my book, The Moral Circle, which again is on Max's shelf. You can see that beautiful ant cover behind Max. There also is a longer, more detailed, and similarly themed book by Jonathan Birch called The Edge of Sentience, which is available open access. You can download it right now. I suggest checking that out. And then, in addition to checking out our work at NYU, at the Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, and at the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy, as well as our wild animal welfare program. In addition to that, if you have interest in these issues on the animal side, there are a bunch of animal protection orgs and centers, but there is a new Jeremy Collar Center for Animal Sentience at the LSE that Jonathan Birch overseas. And then if you have interest in the AI issues, there is great work being done at Elios AI Research, and Robert Long heads that up. So I encourage you to check out those resources in addition to many others.
Amazing. Thanks so much for your talk.
Thank you very much. Really, really enjoyed it. Thanks everybody for attending.